Well, hello. It is good to talk to everyone again. So far, we have been learning about the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, and we've learned a lot about the Old Kingdom. We learned about their social structure. We learned about the pyramids and building the pyramids. We learned about their religion and why they chose to build the pyramids and how that greatly affected their religion. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about, or I'm going to spend some time talking to you about the next section and what happened when the Egyptians stopped building pyramids. So we talked about the Old Kingdom, and it went from 2600 BC or 2600 BC, and it went until 2300 BC. So for about 300 years, we had the Old Kingdom and all the things that they were doing. Today, we're going to start at 2300 BC, and we're going to learn a little bit about what happened during that time period. So first off, as we saw in the movie, in the pyramid, the building of the Great Pyramid, you watched on Monday and Tuesday, you saw that people had started to, towards the end, had started to really wonder, particularly Knocked in the movie, wonder about this idea of building pyramids and what it was such a good idea. Also, what seemed to happen is government officials, they began to get jealous of the pharaoh's power because, as you remember learning, the pharaoh had all the power, and under them were the viziers and then the high priests, and as you can see, there were continued more. But right in the middle were the governors and the government officials, and they kind of got tired of that. So they became jealous. They decided to take over control of Egypt, so they overthrew the pharaoh. And the result of that was for about 200 years, they had confusion. People didn't quite know what they were doing or where they were going. Thankfully, for the Egyptians, pharaohs rose to power again. The idea that being ruled by many can be challenging, and over the course of history, you'll notice that sometimes it can be a problem. People tend to want one person to be in charge, and this was the case for the Egyptians. So that when the pharaohs came back again, they brought peace, um, and it seemed kind of tranquil. The historians have decided to call this, when this peace returned under one pharaoh, the Middle Kingdom. So during this time, the pharaoh ended up not having as much power. So this is where it turned into a better pot for Egypt. Even though there was one person ruling, there were other people that had more say. So one of the changes that happened were after death, they were no longer buried in pyramids, but in tombs cut into cliffs. So here's a picture of some tombs in Egypt now that were cut into cliffs. So I want to tell you a bit more about their tombs and what they believe. Now we've learned a lot already, but I just wanted to tell you some more about it. It was after the pyramids became unpopular that people began to bury dead in tombs. Even though many people had already buried the dead in tombs, it was a time when the royal families began using tombs as well, um, as opposed to the pyramids. The tombs were loved by the ancient Egyptians still, and they would work in them and on them so that they could be nice when their friends and families died. A lot of their life was spent preparing for their afterlife. The tombs were so loved by the ancient Egyptians that they would sometimes go out to visit them when they were on an outing. Like, these tombs were the houses of where they would be when they were in the afterlife. So the families would load up, take a bunch of grave goods to leave in the tombs. So what were some of these grave goods? Well, many of them, and let's look at some more tombs first. So many of the goods that were brought to these tombs were things like amulets, jewelry. They had some toys that would be brought there so that they would, have fun things. In some cases, they found dolls that were in some of these tombs. These are actual artifacts that were found in these tombs. They believed that their loved ones could have fun when they went to the afterlife. Now, a name, and here is a picture of a boat that was actually found in one of the tombs of a pharaoh, of one of the higher ups. So, in addition, they would have canopic jars. They were often found inside these tombs, and as you remember, these jars hold organs of the dead person, things like the brain, the heart. Sorry, the brain wasn't important to them. So the name was very important to ancient Egyptians, though, especially for someone who died. It was believed, here's why. Thus, when someone died, their names had to be written on their coffin or found somewhere close to the body. The reason the person had to have a name was that the Egyptians believed that there were two parts to the soul, the Ba and the Ka. So when a person died, the Ba would go and would have fun and enjoy its life, and the Ka would go and take care of the family. At night, though, the Ba and the Ka would return and come together into the tomb of the body and the mummy so they could get a restful sleep. So this happened daily. If the name was not on the tomb, though, the Ba and the Ka could not know which way to go, and the person would be lost out of the afterlife forever. If you were lost from the afterlife, you would disappear and never come back again. As you can see, again, the afterlife was something that people in the current life lived for. Some would argue that there are people today who continue to live for the afterlife as opposed to the current life. So, some of the writings, families loved to write, and they would write stories and poems and draw pictures on the tombs of their loved ones. They would also write on their own tomb and talk about good things that they had done in their life. People always wanted the gods to know what they had done so that when it was their time to die, the gods would allow them to go to the afterlife, because in order to go to the afterlife, the person had to do good deeds and keep a light heart. And so they had to do things willingly. And they also had to memorize things from the Book of the Dead, if you remember reading about that. Many kings and pharaohs had masks that were found in their tombs. Sometimes things inside the tombs were made out of solid gold. In fact, when Egyptians were buried in the tombs, their family and friends would bring food to them to have something to eat in their afterlife. There have even been boats, as I showed earlier, that have been found in the tombs. So this was important to them, where you were buried. In addition, though, to the burial being different and being buried inside the cliffs, the Egyptians also began to trade with countries beyond the Nile River. They began to look at ways of taking what they had surplus and bringing it to other people and seeing kind of what was out there in the world. This occurred during the Middle Kingdom. And if you think about it, we talked before about how the Egyptians lasted for 300 plus years and no one bothered them. Well, this was partially why. They didn't go anywhere. They kind of traded and hung out with themselves. Eventually, though, if you remember the Delta and how it led into the ocean, they decided to expand and explore further. And that exploration brought them to other civilizations, which then alerted other civilizations about them, that they were there, kind of what they had. So they went and did some trading. The result of that, I believe, was that a group of people called the Hyksos decided to come to Egypt. And with them, there's a controversy about this now. It was written that they invaded Egypt around the end of the Middle Kingdom, around 1786. And it was believed that the reason why they invaded Egypt was because they showed up and they were able to defeat Egypt with their better weapons, with their means of arrival, which was on horse-drawn chariots. And that in general, they were just able to, they had more technologies than Egyptians did. In any case, they did bring with them the horse-drawn chariot. This is an Egyptian horse-drawn chariot. It was questioned that the Egyptians had actually started to make these. However, if you saw in the movies, they didn't have wheels in the Old Kingdom time. So it might have been around the Middle Kingdom that they developed the idea of a wheel, or perhaps through their trade they saw it and brought it back to Egypt. But the Hyksos had horse-drawn chariots. They also had composite bows and arrows, and those were better than the Egyptian spears. They also had bronze daggers, and if you remember watching the movie, the material that Egyptians had was copper. And yes, they had gold, but they weren't really using the gold for weapons. They were using the gold to plate things and for jewelry and things like that. So bronze, when it came in with the Hyksos, were stronger than the copper that the Egyptians had. They also had what's called let's see if I can say this correctly, scimitars. And those were made of bronze as well, and they were pretty effective weapons. So the Hyksos came in, and again, it's questionable whether or not they defeated the Egyptians and took over. Some historians argue that they actually just came in, became a part of Egyptians, assimilated with them, brought in their new technologies, and eventually rose to power that way. Uh, in whatever case, the Hyksos ended up being in power, and their power lasted. There's an argument about this between 100 and 200 years um, that they were in power. While they were in power, they brought in new breeds of animals, they brought in new types of crops, they brought in new musical instruments. They had changes to the way the Egyptians made pottery and weaving, but they also instilled this sense of openness. So what they brought was positive. However, they weren't Egyptians. And so eventually, the Egyptians seemed to not want to be a part of the Hyksos. They didn't want the Hyksos leading them. And what ended up happening was this man, who was an Egyptian, rose to power and he defeated the Hyksos. His name was Amos the First. It has been said that this Egyptian prince used Hyksos weapons and led an uprising and drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and brought us into what then became the New Kingdom. So far we've learned about the Old Kingdom, where they had pyramids and they had pharaohs that were in charge, and then the Middle Kingdom, when the pharaohs were in charge again, but didn't maintain their control for as much control as they had. There were no more pyramids. They began to be buried in tombs. In fact, there's a place called the Valley of Kings, if you want to look something up and read more about that. And then at the end of the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos came in and took over for about 100 to 200 years. And then after that, so that there's no time period for that. It's the Hyksos were in charge. But at the end of their ruling, Amos the First came to power. He led an uprising that defeated Hyksos, probably using their own weapons against them, and established what's known as the New Kingdom. And so the rest of this week, you're going to spend time learning about their writing, Egyptian writing, hieroglyphic writing. And then after that, we will come back again. We'll learn about the New Kingdom and how Egypt really started to flourish during the New Kingdom and a lot of the changes that occurred. And I hope that you have a great week and that you're able to get the rest of your work done. Thanks for listening today.